The place is the Hembrillo Basin in southern New Mexico, a desolate expanse of volcanic rock, thorny scrub, and baking sun. A column of United States Cavalry, the 6th and 9th, is moving through the basin, tracking a band of Apache warriors who have slipped off the reservation. The soldiers are confident. They have rifles, horses, rations, and orders. The Apaches have nothing but the clothes on their backs and the weapons in their hands. But the soldiers do not see what the Apaches see. They do not see that the east-facing sandstone scarps provide perfect vantage points. They do not see that the dip slopes are exposed kill zones. They do not see the breastworks, low stone walls that the Apaches have built along the ridges, turning the entire basin into a fortress. The soldiers ride into the canyon. The Apaches open fire from 3 directions. The cavalry is pinned down, unable to advance, unable to retreat. For an entire day, the soldiers huddle behind rocks, while the Apaches, outnumbered, outgunned, and outsupplied, pick them off one by one. By nightfall, the cavalry is forced to withdraw. The Apaches vanish into the desert like smoke. The soldiers will later report that they fought ghosts, and in a way they did, because the Apache warrior was not just a fighter. He was a master of survival, a genius of terrain, and a phantom who could appear from nowhere, strike with devastating precision, and disappear before his enemy could blink. The Spanish called them Apachu, the enemy. The Mexicans called them Los Diablos, the devils. The Americans called them the most formidable irregular warriors they ever faced. But the Apaches called themselves simply Inde, the people. And for 3 centuries, they held off 2 empires and a republic, fighting from the deserts of northern Mexico to the mountains of Arizona and New Mexico. Today, we are going to understand how they did it. We will strip away the Hollywood caricatures and meet the real Apache warrior, his training, his weapons, his tactics, his spiritual world, and his unbreakable will to survive. By the time we finish, you will see why the Apaches were not just fighters. They were ghosts of the desert, and ghosts, as the cavalry learned, cannot be caught. To understand the Apache warrior, you must first understand the world that shaped him. The Apache did not live in a lush paradise. They lived in the Chihuahuan and Sonoran deserts, a brutal landscape of blistering heat, freezing nights, razor-sharp rocks, and thorny plants that could puncture a horse's hoof. Water was scarce. Food was scarce. The difference between life and death was knowledge, knowing which cactus held drinkable water, which roots were edible, which animal trails led to springs. Apache children were taught this knowledge from the moment they could walk. They learned to read the land like a book. A bent blade of grass meant a man had passed that way. A disturbed pebble meant he was running. A bird flying in a certain direction meant water was near. This was not magic. It was observation, trained to the level of instinct. The Apaches were nomads, moving with the seasons, following the game, never staying in one place long enough to build permanent homes. They lived in wickiups, simple brush shelters that could be constructed in an hour and abandoned without regret. They owned almost nothing. Everything they carried had a purpose and a place. This nomadic lifestyle was not a choice, it was a necessity. The desert could not support permanent villages. And this lifestyle made the Apache warrior the most mobile, most elusive, most self-sufficient fighter in North America. He could travel 100 miles on foot in 3 days, carrying nothing but a weapon, a water container, and a pouch of dried meat. He could survive on field mice, cactus fruit, and the juice of the giant saguaro. He could go for 2 days without water and still fight a battle. The American soldiers, by contrast, needed wagons full of rations, thousands of pounds of grain for their horses, and a supply line stretching back to the nearest fort. The Apaches had no supply line. They were the supply line. They lived off the enemy's cattle, horses, and stores. When they raided, they did not just steal for profit, they stole to survive, and that made them relentless. Now let us talk about how an Apache warrior was made. The training began in early childhood. Apache boys were not coddled. They were toughened. A boy of 5 or 6 would be sent to run errands across long distances, building his endurance. He would be made to sit still for hours in the hot sun, learning patience and self-control. He would be taught to endure pain without crying, to let a thorn be pulled from his foot without flinching, to take a blow without retaliation. This was not cruelty. It was preparation. The Apache believed that a warrior who could not control his own body could not control a battle. Physical toughness was only half the training. The other half was mental and spiritual. Apache boys were taught to be invisible. They learned to move through the desert without leaving tracks, stepping on rocks, walking in dry stream beds, brushing away footprints with a branch. They learned to freeze in place for hours, blending into the landscape, becoming part of the rock and brush. They learned to approach an enemy camp at night, crawling on their bellies, using the shadows of cactus and mesquite for cover. This was not stealth. It was an art form. The American soldiers who fought the Apaches often said that the warriors materialized out of nowhere. That was not magic. That was years of practice. The Apache also learned the concept of risk versus reward. A successful raid was not one that killed many enemies. A successful raid was one that achieved its objective, stealing horses, capturing supplies, gathering intelligence, without losing a single warrior. The Apache valued their warriors too much to waste them in pointless battles. If a raid looked too dangerous, they would abort. If a fight turned against them, they would retreat. There was no shame in retreat. Shame came from getting your brothers killed for nothing. This pragmatic, almost calculating approach to warfare confused the Americans, who believed in standing your ground and fighting to the death. The Apaches saw that as stupidity. Why die when you could live to fight another day? Why fight fair when you could ambush? Why announce your presence when you could strike from the shadows? This was not cowardice. It was intelligence, and it kept the Apache free for 300 years. The Apache warrior did not look like the Hollywood version. He did not wear a feathered war bonnet. That was a Plains Indian tradition. The Apache wore simple, practical clothing, a loincloth. Deerskin leggings, moccasins with flexible soles that allowed him to feel the ground beneath his feet. In cold weather, he wore a buffalo robe or a blanket. In battle, he often stripped to the waist, not for intimidation, but to avoid infection. A bullet or arrow wound was bad enough. Driving dirty cloth into the wound was worse. His face was sometimes painted, but the paint was not decorative. Black paint meant war. Red paint meant blood. White paint meant mourning or peace. The patterns were personal, a warrior's vision given to him in a dream or a spirit quest. He might paint his horse with symbols of protection, handprints, lightning bolts, hailstone marks. His hair was long, often braided and wrapped in fur or cloth. He wore no armor. Armor was too heavy, too hot, and too restrictive. His defense was his speed, his agility, and his knowledge of the terrain. His weapons were simple but deadly. The primary weapon was the bow, a short, powerful bow made from the wood of the mesquite or the juniper tree, backed with sinew for extra power. The arrows were cane or wood tipped with obsidian, flint, or later steel filed from trade goods. An Apache arrow could punch through a leather shield at 50 yards. A skilled warrior could lose 5 or 6 arrows in the time it took a soldier to reload his single-shot rifle. The secondary weapon was the lance, a long wooden shaft tipped with a steel blade used for hunting and for finishing wounded enemies. The third weapon was the knife, often a trade knife or a handmade blade carried in a sheath on the belt. And after the Apaches acquired firearms, through trade, theft, or capture, they became even more deadly. They preferred the repeating rifle, the Winchester or the Henry, because it allowed them to fire multiple shots without reloading. They were not experts with firearms in the way that soldiers were trained, but they did not need to be. They fired from ambush at close range at surprise targets. One shot, one kill, then vanish. Now, let us talk about the most famous Apache leaders. You have heard the names Cochise, Mangus Coloradas, Victorio, Geronimo. But these men were not chiefs in the European sense. They did not command armies. They did not give orders that had to be obeyed. Apache society was fiercely democratic. A leader led by persuasion, by example, by reputation. Men followed him because they respected him, not because they feared him. If a leader made a bad decision, his followers would simply leave and join another band. This made Apache leadership incredibly flexible. A band of 20 warriors could grow to 200 if the leader was successful. It could shrink to 10 if he failed. The leaders who have come down to us in history were the ones who succeeded again and again. Mangus Coloradas, Red Sleeves, was the principal leader of the Chihenne Apache in the mid-19th century. He was a giant of a man, over 6 feet tall, with a reputation for both ferocity and generosity. He fought the Mexicans for decades, then the Americans after the United States took control of the Southwest. He was captured under a flag of truce in 1863, tortured and murdered by American soldiers. His skull was sent to a phrenologist in the East. Cochise, perhaps the most famous Apache leader after Geronimo, led the Chiricahua Apache in a decade-long war against the United States. He was known for his strategic brilliance, his ability to unite different bands, and his absolute refusal to surrender. The U.S. Army built a network of forts across Arizona just to contain him. He finally made peace in 1872, accepting a reservation, but he died of illness 2 years later, still unbowed. Victorio, a Warm Springs Apache leader, fought one of the most remarkable campaigns of the entire Indian Wars. In 1879, he and his band of fewer than 200 people, warriors, women, and children, left the hated San Carlos Reservation and began a running fight across New Mexico, Texas, and northern Mexico. They evaded thousands of American and Mexican soldiers for over a year. They fought at Las Animas Canyon, at Hembrillo Basin, at Fort Tularosa. They raided settlements, stole horses, and vanished into the mountains. But on October 14th, 1880, Victorio and his band were surrounded by Mexican troops at Tres Castillos, a small mountain range in Chihuahua. Victorio fought to the death. He and 77 of his warriors were killed. His sister, the warrior woman Lozen, escaped and later fought with Geronimo. And then there is Geronimo, the name that became a war cry. Geronimo was not a chief. He was a shaman, a spiritual leader, and a fierce warrior who never held formal authority over any band. But his charisma, his visions, and his sheer refusal to accept defeat made him the most famous Apache of all. After the death of Victorio, after the surrender of Cochise's sons, after the U.S. Army had hunted the Apache for decades, Geronimo kept fighting. He led a small band of warriors on raids from Arizona deep into Mexico. The U.S. Army deployed 5,000 soldiers, 1/4 of its entire active force, to catch him. They never did. Geronimo surrendered in 1886, not because he was defeated, but because he was promised that his people would be allowed to return to Arizona. The promise was broken. Geronimo and his followers were sent to Florida, then to Alabama, then to Oklahoma. He died at Fort Sill in 1909, a prisoner of war. But he never stopped being a warrior. The tactics of the Apache warrior were a masterclass in asymmetric warfare. They did not fight fair. They did not want to fight fair. Their goal was not to destroy the enemy army. That was impossible. Their goal was to make the enemy's life so miserable, so costly, so terrifying that the enemy would give up and go home. This is the essence of guerrilla warfare, and the Apaches perfected it. Their favorite tactic was the ambush. They would find a narrow canyon, a dry riverbed, a mountain pass, anywhere that channeled the enemy into a kill zone. They would position themselves on the high ground behind rocks and breastworks. They would wait. Sometimes they would wait for days, motionless, silent, watching. When the enemy entered the trap, the Apaches would open fire from 3 sides. The first volley would kill the officers and the horses. The second volley would kill anyone who tried to flee. The third volley would kill anyone still moving. Then the Apaches would descend, take the weapons and ammunition, cut the horses' hamstrings if they could not take them, and vanish. The entire engagement might last 15 minutes. By the time the enemy's reinforcements arrived, there would be nothing left but bodies and empty cartridge cases. Another favorite tactic was the raid. A small war party, 10 to 20 warriors, would ride into a settlement at night, steal horses and cattle, and ride out before dawn. They avoided killing if possible, because killing brought retaliation. But if they were challenged, they fought with overwhelming violence. The goal was to leave the settlement crippled. No horses, no cattle, no supplies, but alive to tell the story. Fear was a weapon. A settlement that had been raided once would live in terror of being raided again. That terror reduced trade, reduced settlement, reduced the enemy's ability to project power into Apache territory. The third tactic was the feigned retreat. The Apaches would attack an enemy patrol, then turn and flee, looking disorganized and panicked. The enemy would give chase, thinking they had won. The Apaches would lead them into an ambush where the main force was waiting. This tactic worked again and again against inexperienced American and Mexican troops. The fourth tactic was the siege. The Apaches could not storm a fort, but they did not need to. They would surround it, cut off its water supply, kill its livestock, ambush its supply wagons, and wait. A fort that could not be supplied was a fort that had to be abandoned. The Apaches understood logistics better than their enemies. They did not fight the army. They fought the army's supply line. And the supply line was always vulnerable. Now let us talk about the most remarkable aspect of Apache warfare, the role of women. Apache women were not passive victims. They were warriors, scouts, and strategists. The most famous example is Lozan, the sister of Victorio. Lozan was a warrior and a shaman. She fought alongside her brother in every battle. She was said to have a spiritual gift. She could sense the presence of the enemy, feeling their direction and distance in her body. She led war parties. She covered the retreat of women and children. She was never captured. After Victoria's death, she joined Geronimo and fought until the final surrender in 1886. She died of tuberculosis in 1889, still in captivity. Other Apache women fought as well. They defended the camps when the warriors were away. They learned to shoot, to ride, to track. They were not warriors in the same numbers as the men, but they were far from helpless. The Apache believed that strength came from the land, and the land did not care about gender. The end of the Apache Wars came not through military victory, but through attrition. The United States had resources the Apache could never match. Railroads brought troops and supplies. Telegraphs allowed instant communication. The buffalo were gone. The game was gone. The traditional Apache way of life was gone. The final blow was the use of Apache scouts, Apaches recruited by the U.S. Army to track and fight other Apaches. This divided the Apache people against themselves. Some bands surrendered, hoping for peace. Others fought on, led by Geronimo. But by 1886, it was over. Geronimo surrendered for the last time. The Chiricahua Apache, including the scouts who had helped the army, were all sent to prisons in Florida. They were not allowed to return to Arizona until 1913. By then, the desert they had known was gone. Fences, towns, roads, the ghosts had nowhere left to hide. So what can we learn from the Apache warrior? First, that knowledge of the land is the ultimate weapon. The Apaches did not outfight the U.S. Army. They outsmarted it. They used the terrain as a force multiplier, turning every canyon, every ridge, every dry wash into a fortress. Modern special forces train the same way, studying the environment, using it for cover and concealment, making the land their ally. The Apaches invented that approach 200 years ago. Second, that discipline is not about following orders. It is about self-control. The Apache warrior could sit in the hot sun for hours without moving. He could go without water for 2 days. He could suppress his fear, his hunger, his thirst, his desire to run. That is harder than obeying a command. That is mastery of the self. Third, that survival is more important than glory. The Apaches did not fight for medals or statues. They fought to live another day, to feed their families, to keep their land. When a raid looked too dangerous, they walked away. When a battle turned against them, they retreated. There is no shame in surviving. The shame is dying for nothing. Fourth, that a people who cannot be caught cannot be conquered. The Apaches were never defeated in battle. They were starved out, outlasted, outnumbered. But they were never broken. Geronimo died a prisoner. Cochise died on a reservation. Victorio died with his face to the enemy. But none of them surrendered their spirit. That spirit, the Apache spirit, is still alive today. The Apache people still live in Arizona, New Mexico, and Oklahoma. They still speak their language. They still dance their dances. They still remember the ghosts of the desert. Today, you can walk the battlefields of the Apache Wars. You can stand at Hembrillo Canyon, where the 6th Cavalry was pinned down by a handful of warriors. You can climb Tres Castillos, where Victorio made his last stand. You can visit Fort Bowie, the crumbling adobe outpost that the army built to fight Cochise. The wind still blows across the desert, the sun still bakes the rocks, and if you listen carefully, you can almost hear them. The soft footfall of moccasins on stone, the creak of a bow being drawn, the whisper of an arrow in flight. The Apache warriors are gone, but the desert remembers, and the ghosts of the desert never truly fade. They are waiting, watching, ready to remind the world that a people who master the land can never be mastered. That is the story of the Apache warriors, masters of survival and combat, the ghosts who taught America how to fear the dark.